remember what it is. Well, okay, so the long sentence thing. I was, what is it now? 2-3 years ago, I was reading a novel by the Swiss writer Friedrich Dürrenmatt. Someone had said, "This is great, check this out," etc. And so I picked it up, and there was this crazy thing going on where this was supposed to be a murder mystery, but each chapter was a single sentence, and that would go on for 3 or 4 pages. So not like a Richard Brautigan, line and a half sentence, and that would be the whole chapter, but substantial sentences. And it was interesting, in part because they were not meandering, Faulknerian, Proustian, Jamesian sentences. And you mentioned Cormac McCarthy. They weren't doing that at all. They were sort of roaring down the page, and made things really sort of ominous and unusual. And I read about 4 of his chapters and shut the book because I knew it was pretty exciting. I wanted to do something with it. I had no idea what at that time. So anyway, that idea was in the back of my mind. And then I had this idea about someone who's experienced the worst possible personal calamity. And it struck me that, that's kind of like getting a sentence placed on you. You've been sentenced to something, to extreme unhappiness, etc. Your life has changed. And that set off this echo with the idea for long sentences that Dürrenmatt had used. And so that's kind of where it came from. And then I ran with it when I started to write the book. There were a couple of other things that went into the mix in terms of subject matter, but something about having that, okay, you're going to write, each chapter will be a single sentence, made it sort of tortuous and really pleasurable at the same time, which is like my writing experience generally, I suppose.
Well, as a reader, it's a good sort of trick to say, well, I just have to finish this sentence. And then I'll go to bed. Just one more sentence.
Just one sentence.
I found, I really got into this style. I enjoyed it quite a bit. So I appreciate the experiment, and I think it worked. I think it was awesome. Can you tell us about the origin of the story and the research you may have done in possibly Barcelona or wherever? Could you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. That was, I mentioned, that was the sort of the third piece of the puzzle for me was. In terms of content, so I had the idea of personal calamity, I had these sentences, but that wasn't, that still something else was needed, and I took a trip, I sort of tagged along when my wife, the poet Eleni Sikelianos, who's also published by Coffee House, hi Chris and Esther, etc. folks, she was invited to a literary festival in Barcelona, and we had our very young daughter at the time, who was sort of constantly strapped to my person as I wandered around the city, and Eleni did these sort of more official duties. And I was really captured. I mean, Barcelona is an amazing city. I'd never been there before. I was, in the first instance, immediately taken aback and sort of delighted, but also perturbed and all of that, one doesn't necessarily hear a lot of Spanish in the streets of Barcelona. One hears Catalan. So I've been all ready, my phrase book and ready with my so forth. And people, of course, spoke Spanish, but anyway, so there was that little torque to start things out, that it's a Catalan city, and they're proud of their language. The other thing was going to all these structures that were designed by Antoni Gaudi, the great Catalan architect, where his great cathedral that looks like a cathedral sort of performs in some ways that function well when it's finished. It's still under construction, but it's also the spaces are torqued. I think angles are off. It's really sort of wonderful defamiliarization of things that seem sort of straightforward. An apartment building where there are no right angles in the interior, that kind of thing. And then also this really pretty elaborate culture of living statues. For those of you who have been to Barcelona, there's the central pedestrian walkway, Las Ramblas, that has this really elaborate series of living statues. So these aren't just the Statue of Liberty and someone who's got some the white pancake makeup on and being a mime doing that sort of thing. That's there too, but there are also like 4 living statues who are impersonating trees. So you've got this forest all of a sudden. It's really quite marvelous. And there is a silver angel, or often on Las Ramblas. So it was these things that, and then this, this idea of personal catastrophe that formed a cocktail along with that constraint of the sentences. So that's kind of, and I went back to Barcelona later and did some more research. But it really came out of that first week-long trip of just wandering around this amazing city.
Were you able to, did you have any conversations with the living statue artists? Did you speak to them about what they're doing and what it entails? Any of that?
Yeah, there's that thing. It's sort of like when you go to one of like a recreation of a colonial town, and there's always that person on the tour who wants to try and get the person who's imitating someone from the 17th century to say, what do you do in your real life and that sort of thing, and they say, my real life, good sir, what do you mean? And talking to a living statue is not terribly rewarding. And you're more likely to be jeered by the people around you. But I did catch some people afterwards, and I was interested to find out sort of, well, what do you do? Yeah, what do you do in the off hours and when you're not this extraordinary creation? And it was kind of like, well, what do you do when you're not doing your job? I go and I get have a drink. I live my life. I run from my creditors, all of that sort of thing. But nonetheless, these are people who come from all over Europe, all over the world, really, to do their thing on this sort of famous pedestrian walkway, and that was part of this sense of, you have your space, you have the place where you set up, and there's a kind of hierarchy, people who are higher up the boulevard. And that kind of thing. So those little details from interactions with different people, or even just walking by Atlas, who had set the world onto the cobblestones next to him and was sweeping up the space in front of his site. I mean, that was pretty amazing to me. He was all painted in blue, and there was the world lying there, looking a little worse for wear, I must say. But those kinds of things were amazing to just observe and also to interact with the people as well.